Welcome to Child's Voice Project's January Roundtable. My name is Atia Mosley, and I am our Chief Legal Officer. These roundtables serve as a place for knowledge sharing and learning. We are building a clearinghouse of research-based best practices for child-centeredness, and we invite you to bring your ideas and your questions to these forums. We are placing a link to our website in the chat where you can access our recorded roundtables from 2025. We're beginning this year with a focus on child-centeredness, which is our mission and the focus of our work. We aspire to create a world where every child is heard. We encourage you to type your name, location, and professional identification in the chat, as well as any questions or comments you may have throughout the presentation. We believe that our time together will be better because of your participation. Let's get started. As professionals in the field of children and families, we might not all have the tools needed to garner information that enables us to understand children and consider their needs from a child-centered perspective. Some of us may have learned about child development in school. Others may have firsthand experience as parents, but most of us are not taught how to elicit information from children and then use that information in our professional settings. We may also have biases that create resistance against child-centered practices due to our years of experience, including possibly the belief that adults know best. We really hope that you will consider Child's Voice Project and our research as your go-to place to learn about child-centeredness and how best to apply its principles in your professional setting and in your decision-making. Child-centeredness is the foundation of our work, and here we are studying what makes child-centered principles effective. Our research results can be used to help improve any system that serves children and their families. However, we first need to understand, what is it that we mean when we say child-centeredness? I'm wondering, what comes to mind when you hear that term? What does child-centeredness mean to you? We're going to put together a word cloud. If you haven't done it before, it's relatively simple. You will be able to scan on the QR code or use the link in the chat to go to slido.com and enter the number on the screen. You don't have to have a Slido account to participate. Any route that you take will get you directly to the poll. All right. So I see we have some participants. So what comes to mind when you hear the term child-centeredness? So I see collaborative, inquisitiveness, listen, honoring, witness, the child is leading, interest in the child's input, curious, sensitive, compassionate, inclusive, all such great ideas around what child-centeredness means. And we appreciate you participating. As you all have demonstrated, there are many different ways to think of child-centeredness. Our understanding of child-centeredness can change over time, especially as our professional experiences change. Child-centeredness practices may also differ based on your field or your educational focus. So what do we mean here at Child's Voice Project when we use the term child-centeredness? Let's turn now to our Executive Director and Chief Scientific Officer, Dr. Steph Sloan. Dr. Steph, will you please tell us what you want our attendees to understand about the term child-centeredness?
I think the one thing that is really important to know is that definitions of child-centeredness vary across discipline, and not all disciplines even talk about child-centeredness. They don't all talk about it like that. We talk about it like that. And I do hear various professionals using words like child-centered. But typically when we think about like what are the skills of relating to children, we talk about it like it's an orientation. Not all professionals talk about it that way. And it really varies. So I thought it would be helpful to think about how different disciplines talk about child-centeredness, because this concept comes from and it's combined with a lot of different disciplines and the way that we talk about it. In education, and I had the pleasure of serving as a public school teacher for over a decade. In education, we talk a lot about child-centeredness. We don't always directly teach what child-centeredness is, but we do talk a lot about it. The way that education professionals talk about it, though, is really thinking about it from the learning perspective. So when we're teaching children something, we really need to anchor that within the child's developmental age and stage, their abilities, their learning needs, their interests. There's this theory, I really love this theory, but we're not going to go too far into the weeds with it, but it's called the zone of proximal development theory. And it's basically like you meet that child where they are. They show you where you, as the teacher, are picking up. And you're taking what they already bring to the table, their strengths, their interests, their needs, their desires, and you start there. And then you bring them to a new learning space by kind of scaffolding new knowledge. In child psychology, we talk more about it from the perspective of brain development. So we talk about concepts like attunement, being attuned to a child, thinking about like self-initiated play, social interactions, and how brain development and cognition are really shaped and formed by these different activities. The child psychology domain and neuroscience in general doesn't really use the term child-centered. Instead, they use other kinds of terms to describe the way that a child's context, interests, needs, and individuality shape their brain development along with their environment. In social work and in child welfare, we tend to talk about child-centeredness from the perspective of a clinical setting. So thinking about the child as the client. We think about how we should be prioritizing the child's well-being, their voice, their rights. And we talk about that when the child is the client, their lived experience, development, and context really shape that therapeutic relationship and should be a central point of guiding that clinician in the work together. But we are hoping to come up with a more centralized definition of child-centeredness that really brings in and reflects how other disciplines talk about it, but also brings in some ingredients and talks about it in a new but more organized way. Next slide, please. So here are some similarities and differences in the ways that various disciplines talk about it. All of the theories and the ways that child-centeredness is referred to, it's rooted in child development. So their development ages, their stages, their abilities, their developmental needs. All of the theories also talk about the child's context, the way that their lived experience should shape the way that we interact with that child. Some big differences is that not all disciplines talk about strengths in relation to the child's developmental needs. Many disciplines tend to see a more needs-based approach, like, what does the child need? What have they not yet developed? What are we here to help them develop? And how do we as adults need to understand really the boundaries and roles of adult-child interactions in relation to where the child is developmentally? But not all disciplines talk about developmental strengths. And it doesn't mean that they ignore developmental strengths. It means that they don't see the child-centered definition or the related concepts in relation to the child's strengths. Everybody uses different language to describe these shifts across disciplines. Everybody uses a different weight and appraisal of the child's context and lived experience. Some disciplines put a great deal of weight on the child's lived experience, social work, for instance, whereas other disciplines, such as law, child psychology, put less of an emphasis on that lived experience and think more about other kinds of adult behaviors that influence the child. They also have different perspectives on children's rights and autonomy. And I would be remiss if I didn't say we don't all share the same values about children and whether or not they should and do have rights. And that doesn't mean that we're in disagreement and that this is a point of contention. It just means that we don't, across discipline, have the same perspective on this. And then different people's professions have various legal ethics, professional ethics that they're guided by. And so their definitions and the way they talk about child-centeredness is really impacted by that. Next slide, please. So we at Child's Voice Project are working towards a definition. Why do we need a definition? It sounds like we have lots of information about what child-centeredness is. Well, if we can't define it, we can't measure it. And being able to measure child-centeredness really helps us as professionals better understand where we have opportunities to grow. It also helps us better understand how our thoughts about child-centeredness maybe need to change. Where do we have some short-sightedness? Where do we have some biases? So being able to measure something scientifically is really important to be able to evolve our definitions, change our practice, and be better child-centered practitioners and providers. And then recognizing that child-centeredness is an orientation adopted by adults, which requires skills. We can only teach those skills when we have an understanding of what it means to be child-centered and the skills that go along with that. And so at Child's Voice Project, we're really interested in being able to consider and then test that child-centeredness can function as a protective factor. Now, I'm giving you a little preview about what we'll be talking about next month, which is protective factors. But just a quick background, when there is adversity, adverse childhood experiences, childhood adversity, when anyone has adversity at all, there are things that we can do to lessen the harms and to buffer folks against the negative consequences of adversity. And those are called protective factors. It's almost like giving a child a sword and a shield that can protect them against things that they experience as they move through life. We as adults can't always keep children from experiencing adversity. And it's not always best for children to never experience adversity. We learn by experiencing adversity, but we don't want children to experience adversity that harms them for the rest of their lives. And that's what protective factors do for us. They give us as adults the ability to give children tools to navigate adversity and to arise from that adversity without negative consequences and instead with new strengths and superpowers. Next slide, please. So, child-centeredness. Know that my dogs are so excited about me talking about this definition of child-centeredness that you may be able to hear them in the background. They immediately started cheering loudly when this slide came on the screen. So, child-centeredness, what are the core ingredients as defined by us, Child Voice Project? And just another disclaimer that this is a fluctuating definition. Just like we should be growing as professionals, our definitions should be growing professionally too. And so this is what we recognize as being some of the core ingredients. It's not all inclusive, but what are those core ingredients? One, child development. So we have to have a knowledge of developmental ages and stages. And we don't necessarily need to know everything about development. We just need to know enough to understand general ages and stages. But we also need an attention to both their developmental needs and strengths. It's my favorite quip when I'm teaching my social work students to talk about how we love to talk about the frontal lobe like it just emerges one day in early adulthood. Like, poof, there it is. But our frontal lobe develops over time. And as it's developing, children have different strengths that they bring to the table. The way that their brains are formed in that specific moment, it's a strength, it's a way of seeing the world. And brains are constantly changing. And so we get to constantly be learning from children's developmental strengths. Another core ingredient is relationship building, being able to prioritize building trust and then developing a holistic understanding of the child's interests, priorities, ways of thinking about and seeing the world. If you've ever had a conversation with a 2-year-old, they have such an interesting way of seeing the world. And it really takes us approaching that 2-year-old with curiosity. They have limited language. And so the way that they're going to describe their lived experience is going to be pretty interesting. And the more curious that we can be about that, the more we will benefit from just learning more about how that child is seeing the world. What I mean by holistic understanding is being able to get a sense of who that child is from many angles. So, learning one thing about that child doesn't mean we know all about that child. It's really important for us to learn all parts of the child. What are they interested in? What do they like? What do they dislike? What do they bristle at when we as adults say certain things? What is the language that they prefer to use versus some of the words that don't make as much sense to them? Really learning about that child from all angles. But I think the most important part is like how that child sees the world, being able to really engage with that child to where you can see through their lens at the world and be able to almost set aside your own lens to prioritize that child's lens. That's relationship building. Then third is child-centered communication. So we know that there are skills involved in talking to children, and sometimes these skills feel really elusive, but really there are fairly prescriptive and clear sets of rules around communicating well with children. So that curiosity mindset, instead of approaching something with like judgment or discernment, we would instead say, huh, that's interesting. Can you tell me more? Tell me more about why you think that. That's modeling a curiosity mindset. Also asking quality and developmentally informed questions. So there are some really good tried and true rules around how to ask children good questions. Also being able to infuse your knowledge of their age and stage and framing the question, because the answers that we get from children are only as good as the quality of a question we ask. So being able to, utilize that knowledge, integrate knowledge of child development, ask quality questions, and then modeling active listening and validation. I used to tell this story to my students, my social work students, about when I taught in public school. I could get rid of 95% of child just behavior issues or complaints or challenges by simply validating them. And I didn't even have to always do something about it. In fact, most of the time, the child did not expect me to do anything about the problem. They just wanted me to acknowledge their discomfort, their state of mind, the experience that they were having in that moment. And being able to model for that child active listening and validation really gave them a sense of like, okay, I said that thing was heard. We can all move on now. It's such a powerful skill. And then finally, collaborative problem solving. So collaborative problem solving isn't necessarily giving a child two choices and saying you can have this for dinner or that for dinner, although that might be very appropriate depending on the situation. Engaging in collaborative problem solving with the child means you're also engaging that knowledge of child development. So you're using your awareness of the child's age and stage. You're identifying with that child some of the key issues. You're letting them identify some of the key issues. I find this to be one of the most interesting and powerful things about working with children, because what I'm seeing as the adult, as the primary problem or issue in a moment, oftentimes is very different than what a child will see. And if I can simply slow down and rather than trying to get the child to solve the problem I see, we slow down and I listen to them. What do you think the problems are here? What's most important that we need to solve and address? What are the things that are most important to you that we address? Because oftentimes the way that we're seeing a problem, it's through an adult lens, and the child is seeing it through a completely different viewpoint. If we can work with them and listen to how they're identifying the problems, we can work together better to identify options and solutions. And then once we've done that together, we can together create a strategy for those solutions, for trying out those solutions. And what I really love about creative problem solving with children is it's one of the most powerful developmental skills. Being able to model for children how adults problem solve and how you can problem solve together collaboratively teaches them really powerful problem solving skills that they wouldn't learn in any other context. Next slide. What is child-centeredness versus what it isn't? These are the most frequent things that people respond to me with when I talk about child-centeredness. They say, "Oh, you're just involving kids in adult problems." That's not actually the case. Being child-centered doesn't mean you're going to a child and in the family law context, for example, saying, "What parent do you want to live with?" We're instead being really strategic and we're using our developmentally appropriate questions and we're using our quality questions to ask them and really listen and understand what they think the problem is from their perspective. Then we're engaging in strategic and collaborative problem solving that actually helps alleviate some of that pressure. So we often think that we need to save children from adult problems, and instead we inadvertently immerse kids in adult problems. I think about this all the time with teenagers, and we're sending them to schools. Schools are really different places to be than they used to be. They have new problems. Kids have social media. They are very aware of what the world's problems look like, way more than we were ever aware at their same age. And instead of assuming that we can solve for that by simply just keeping them out of making choices or keeping them out of the conversation, we can actually be really strategic and involve them meaningfully and involve them in a way that teaches them skills about how to navigate all of that complexity. And so if we think about child-centeredness as like involving them in adult problems, it probably means that we're not using the level of nuanced skills that we should be. We're not approaching the issues with as much strategy or forethought or foresight. And we're not really considering the actual lived experience of children and youth, which is they're already immersed in adult problems. They need skills and they need a voice. They need to be able to participate meaningfully. And we have the opportunity to do that. I also hear all the time that child-centeredness is indulgent or permissive. You're just letting kids run the show. You're letting them decide things. If you give kids the freedom to decide they'll eat ice cream for dinner every night, that's kind of a myth. I know that kids probably really love ice cream, but if you actually gave kids the opportunity to eat ice cream for dinner every night, they'd find out pretty quickly that they do not want to do that. So I think we often think that we have to save kids from choices and options, but we also have this tendency to believe that letting children participate in their lives is somehow letting them run the show or do things or make decisions that are above their developmental age and stage. But when we actually think about it from a child-centered, intentional, strategic approach, we're coming to the table with, the ability to collaboratively problem solve. We've built relationships with them, so we have a good sense of what their needs are because we've spent plenty of time with them. We've listened to them. We've modeled that validation, and now we have a foundation for which we can really be effective with problem solving, with thinking through issues, with talking through things with their limitations. What's the benefit of trying this solution over that solution? And all children, all developmental ages and stages have the ability to do that in some kind of way. And so what we're doing is we're leaning into those developmental strengths and we're helping them develop skills for navigating difficulty, for navigating challenging circumstances. And those skills turn into protective factors that then buffer against the consequences of adversity. Next slide, please. This is just a quote that we've included that it's really important to just root in this. Child-centered practices provide adults with the meaningful skills required to unlock the potential within every child. I love thinking about child-centeredness as it's really a thing that an adult can do to unlock the strengths and potential that are really inherent within every child. And it's our behavior that needs to change in order to help them reach into and get the benefits of their own potential. Next slide. So we are testing out child-centeredness, and we're doing that through our pilot project in Maryland, where we are using a client-directed approach to representation of children in family court, specifically for complex cases. And some of our very talented attorneys are here with us today. We're currently operating in St. Mary's and Charles counties in Maryland. We launched just last year, May of 2025, and to date, we've represented over 20 children and counting. We do provide training to our attorneys on child-centeredness. That approach is foundational. And we are also testing out some unique ways of being child-centered in the family court space. And one of those things that we're trying to do is that attorneys spend at least 3 to 5 hours building relationships with their clients before they do anything, like substantial or procedural. And now I will caveat this with attorneys do not always have that luxury, right? Some cases really have pressing matters that require attorneys to move quickly and to both simultaneously build relationship with their child while also doing some of those bigger procedural things. But I will say within our pilot project, we are testing out what are the implications, what's the impact on these cases when attorneys have the ability to just prioritize relationship building. Atia, is there anything else you'd like to add about that?
Sure, and thanks. You have said so much, and I'm sure that everyone is scribbling down notes as they're listening to you. So, one of the distinctions with this particular pilot project is that the attorneys are representing their child clients in the same way that they would represent an adult. So, there's an attorney-client relationship. And one of the key distinctions that I share with people who, when I say what kind of work that I did here in North Carolina for about 10 years representing children, they always sort of go to, oh, you mean like a guardian ad litem? And one of my responses would be, well, in the work that I do, I don't substitute my judgment for the judgment of my clients. And that is one of the big strengths of the model that we're studying in Maryland to see when children are listened to and their preferences are considered. And it's interesting when Steph talked about people will say if you ask children what they want, they will asked to have ice cream for dinner. That same myth was alive and well here in North Carolina, and I would often use that example, despite the fact that almost all of my clients would ask for things that were really legitimate and very often profound. And most of the preferences were based on their own like personalities, like one client wanting to ride his bike home from school and not have his father pick him up at the end of the school day with his sisters because he really valued having that time by himself. And so the different models of representation, even though with the child's advocate attorney, you don't have the substitution of judgment. One of the things that we're going to be looking at is how can child-centered principles help professionals regardless of the model of representation, regardless of whether or not they're in family court, regardless of whether or not you're an attorney. So we're looking at the different ways that child-centeredness can be enacted and to demonstrate how effective it can be. And as Dr. Steph mentioned earlier, not everyone shares the same values when it comes to children. And we certainly understand that, but part of our mission is to educate the professionals who come to us for training and, you know, perhaps one day we'll be able to do this on the world stage outside of family court and show that because of the work that we've started in Maryland, how effective child-centered practices truly are and how we can use them to partner with children and help them to develop into like really self-knowing individuals as they grow up. And so we're helping them to be able to develop that as well. So after, I guess I'll turn it over and see Dr. Steph, is there anything else you would like to share with people today about child-centeredness?
Yeah, I think I like what you mentioned about like client directed representation is certainly one way of being child centered. And there are also lots of different ways of representing children. And sometimes, there are more options within jurisdictions than others. And so it is absolutely possible to be child centered with any model of representation. It's also possible to be child centered regardless of your profession.
Mhm.
And like one thing I love about these skills is they transcend like the same skills that I teach my social work students. I also teach, education students because those principles follow. And, one of the things that we're really interested in doing with just better defining those skills is better understanding what are the ripple effects of being child-centered. For example, when you're a child-centered parent, do you notice that you have fewer behavior problems from your children? Do you notice that you have more compliance? And I say compliance, that's not my favorite word, of course, as a child-centered professional. But, one of the things that just when I study, parenting, what I see is that there's a lot of evidence to support the fact that when we give our children a voice, in our homes, in our families, they're way more likely to accept when they're not going to get their way. And they're way more respectful about communicating that because we have modeled the kind of communication that is collaborative with them, and they will use that back to us. Um, in the social work profession, when we are child centered, and you know, I would say this is true in social work and in child welfare. There are studies that have shown that when we can give children a voice, when we can listen to them, help them feel some sense of autonomy. For children that are involved in child welfare proceedings specifically, that even when the outcome doesn't go their way, even when it's not what they wanted, they are more accepting of the outcome and of the next steps because they did have an opportunity to participate. We also see in other domains of research that giving children a voice and being able to use child-centered practices simply help them be better citizens. They have a sense of self-efficacy. They are more likely to be able to go out into the world and use their voice to help others. They feel more empowered, and they recognize that they are agents of change, that they can make a difference. And child-centered skills are really correlated in the literature In research, we see that when we can provide children a voice, they continue to use those skills, and those skills continue to benefit us as a society and beyond. One other note that I will make about child-centeredness and its utility is we can't always change the circumstances that we see children in. We see children in really difficult and horrible circumstances. And as adults, I think we often feel powerless and we feel like we need to take steps to change the risk, to prevent the risk. But the thing is, when we come from a risk prevention perspective, we're one, misleading ourselves as adults to think that we can actually prevent risk for children. We can't. And two, we miss an opportunity. When we're only trying to move obstacles out of the way, we miss the opportunity to help the children and work with the children to identify what the obstacles are and then work together with that child to figure out how to shift them out of the way and which ones really need to be moved versus which ones don't. And I always find like my children should actually probably get citations on all of my work because they have really informed me in this way more than anything. I have a house full of teenagers. And I often think like, oh, don't drive at night because it's too scary and I need to remove the risk. And they remind me like, hey, there's risk out there all the time. And they are the ones that remind me I can't remove all the obstacles. And if I continue to try to remove all the obstacles, they miss the opportunity to learn how to drive well at night. And
Mhm.
that's a very simple, like over reductive example. But when I'm talking to attorneys and judges, I hear often like we just want to make the right decision because we want to remove the obstacles for these children. And that is such a noble perspective. And it reminds me like we all really just we want to help kids. We all do. But we can't always move the obstacles. But what we can do is take a child-centered orientation to figure out how to navigate them together so that they have a model, they have an example of it, and they can learn that skill and they can continue to practice that skill and then they can do it later on their own. And I think that's what makes child-centeredness so powerful. We'll move to the next slide, and I just will talk briefly about some of the ways that we're doing some research about child-centeredness here at Child's Voice Project. So we are conducting a full scope evaluation of our pilot project. It's one avenue for testing child-centeredness, but we're also looking at other things like what is the specific role of relationship building? When we can build those things in, when we can use it as a component, we can use it as an approach that everybody uses across the board, then we can start to learn things like how does it help navigate case complexities? How does it help solve problems? How does it help drive the case towards amicable remedy rather than fueling, adversarial, difficult, complex proceedings that just continue to snowball? And so we're really looking at those different types of outcomes. And our pilot project attorneys are so amazing and wonderful at helping us collect that data. Um, Child-centeredness interview study. This is something that we will be launching within the next few weeks. I'm very excited about this study. We obviously have adult-centered definitions of child-centeredness that we've presented to you today, but we want to learn about how children define it. And we're not going to go to children and be like, hey, you, how do you define child-centeredness? Because they'd be like, what? Instead, we're going to be asking them, like, what are the behaviors that adults can take that really help you feel seen, that help you feel heard? When you have a problem, what is a response that an adult can take that helps you move through that problem? What are some things that adults do that really make it hard for you to solve problems, to learn things, to try things? And we're going to be asking children from their perspectives across ages and stages and really learning more about what are those adult behaviors that we need to be considering and thinking about and teaching about when it comes to helping children feel a sense of trust and belonging, autonomy, and empowerment. So we're hoping that if you have children in your lives or you know children and you'd like to participate, you will see some information coming out soon about that study.
All right. So, so much great information is going to come out of our evaluation. We're very excited about it. And we want to use that information to help train professionals, whether you are in family court, if you're an attorney or not, if you're some kind of other professional, even completely unrelated to family court. We believe that the training that we're going to be putting on later in the year can benefit you in your dealings with children, certainly in a professional setting, and perhaps even those of you who are raising children at home may get some information that can help you in that child rearing. So I have put a link into the chat, or you can use the QR code on the screen. We have a very short interest form to let you know, so we can let you know when the trainings are going to be scheduled and have you come and join us. And it will likely be virtual initially. So hopefully wherever you are, you should be able to come and be part of learning how to elicit information from children in order to use it for your own professional work and in your own decision making. So we're looking forward to that. And as we're nearing the end of our time, we have time for questions. If anyone has any questions, feel free to either place them in the chat, or if you're not shy and you want to come off of mute and ask a question, you're welcome to do so now. Come on in, Connie.
Thank you kindly. So, Steph, when you were talking about the core ingredients of child-centeredness and the third one about the communication, could you give an example of, I think the slide's not up, but I think it was the listening and the affirming, just to kind of flesh it out example. Yeah, there we go. Thanks.
Yeah, so I mean, the first part is modeling a curiosity mindset. So when a child says something, our first gut reaction is usually to judge it or to correct it or to appraise it or make some kind of inference from that. But the first step is to stay curious and say, huh, that's really interesting. Can you tell me more about that? Help me understand why you think that. Tell me about the experience that you had. Can you say more? Just asking really open-ended questions, right? Yeah, or as Emily says, we try to fix it. And we instead can just ask. We can just ask and get more information, stay open, stay curious. And when we're really like thinking about problems that kids have, again, I always say, what are the bigger problems that you think, what matters most to you right now? What's mostly on your mind? What do you think needs to be solved? And sometimes I'll say, I really think it seems like this thing here is a big problem, but I want to know what you think from your perspective. Do you feel like it's a big problem, or do you feel like there are other things that are more important? Other questions that I typically ask kids is they will say something to me, and then I will model active listening and validation by repeating back to them using some of their own words and some of mine. So I'll paraphrase what they said, but I'll use some of their words and some of my own words. And I'll say, did I understand that correctly? Did I get anything wrong? Another thing that I love to do to just model the curiosity mindset is when a child tells me something, I will ask them, do you want information? Do you want advice? Or do you just want me to listen? I ask them what they want me to do with that information, especially when they're providing, kind of intense information. And, like, again, it gets back to the fixing, the feeling like we have to like remove risks and obstacles, when instead, maybe we just need to ask them, like, I'm here. Is there a role that you think I should play? Um, I often, when my kids tell me things, I will say, do you want any help with that? Or do you just want me to be a listening ear? Just because it gives them the ability to set the course of action. Like, what's the purpose? Help me understand. Um, if I'm there to do something very specific with them, for example, I've had to interview children about child maltreatment. I've had to do things like that. That's part of the jobs that I've fulfilled. And those are really difficult. And I'm speaking specifically about like in a clinical setting, not in a forensic setting. I'm just making that distinction because in a forensic setting, we use a structured protocol and a specific format. But in a clinical setting, when a child is sharing something with me, I need to really understand a lot more information before I know what my next step needs to be. Um, when I'm talking to children, teenagers about risky behavior and, really needing to ask quality, developmentally informed decisions. For example, talking to younger kids, and they may not have the language to really be specific, right? So when a kid says something, they'll say a word, and I'm like, I'm thinking in my head that that word doesn't seem like the right match, but I want to understand what they're saying. I'll say, okay, so you said the tree. Tell me more about the tree. Help me understand the tree. So I'll just ask, tell me more about, help me understand, or let's draw a picture of what you're trying to talk through. Show me. There are lots of ways to ask developmentally informed questions when I'm talking to teenagers. I, you know, I'm going to be able to talk more to a teenager like I'm talking to an adult, but with some slight modifications. I'm going to be really letting them define words for me. The thing I love about teenagers and asking them follow-up questions is they get really specific about the words that you use. And they will be like, no, don't use that word, use this word. But all of it, like the whole premise is rooted in stay curious, ask questions rather than make assumptions, and model the back and forth, model the active listening. Um, my kids will do it back to me. They will repeat something I said and say, am I understanding you correctly? And usually they do it when they want to call me out on something. But I appreciate the fact that they're using the strategy. It's very helpful.
Excellent. Must be fun having a child developmentalist as a mother. So.
I think that if you were to ask them, they would tell you that they're very tired of hearing about science.
Excellent. Any other questions? Yeah. All right. Well, we really appreciate everyone joining us today. We're very excited about the content of the roundtables this year, and we look forward to having you come back on Wednesday, February 18th, when we will be talking about adverse childhood experiences and protective factors. And Dr. Steph gave a great preview of what's to come, and we appreciate you being part of this developing cohort, and we look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you. Have a great rest of your day.